Today we're going to be diving into the top 10 strength intelligence builds in Elden Ring. In this video we'll focus on the top weapons that combine strength and intelligence as the highlights of our rating system. We won't be delving into offensive casting abilities or armor sets, even though many of these weapons synergize well with the Blaidd armor set and some other armor pieces. Keep in mind that these builds have been rigorously tested on New Game +8, which is the highest difficulty in the base game, and we won't be considering their early game applications for our rating system. The characters we used to test these builds were between level 300 and 350. If you have any additional ideas to enhance these builds while you're listening, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And without further ado, let's get into it.
At number 10, we have the Blaidd build, aka the Wolfdaddy build. This build is centered around the Royal Greatsword. These are the recommended talismans for this build. This build is banking on frost damage and melee attacks. Against bosses, overall, this performed okay. Since you have the frost buildup and heavy hitting attacks, you didn't really run into too many issues when it came to your average boss. Fundamentally, the way this build works is that you use your Ash of War to get the frost proc, and then you proceed to beat the crap out of the enemy with your big sword. For those reasons, it was really easy to do that against your average boss. However, when it came to more agile bosses, this build sucked. They were constantly evading our Ash of War, making it difficult to build up frostbite. Against large bosses, this was a lot easier to do, since you typically had a wider opportunity to get those Ash of Wars off. For those reasons, we're going to be giving the Blaidd build a 7 out of 10 for average bosses, a 0 out of 3 for agile, and a 1.5 out of 3 for large. For open world, this performed a little below average. The only notable AoE effect was the Ash of War, and aside from that, it lacked the ability to efficiently clear large mobs, making it perform averagely in most situations without truly shining on its own. And for those reasons, we're going to be giving it a 2.5 out of 5. The Ash of War fared poorly in PvP due to its predictability, making it easy to avoid while making you vulnerable in the process. The true advantage in PvP lies in the unique crouch poke ability exclusive to these swords. The defense in this build left much to be desired. While the Ash of War's jump ability offered occasional evasion, it often left you vulnerable, particularly to range attacks. Though it can be used for blocking, the guard boost is only average, and at this stage of New Game Plus, trading damage for defense isn't worthwhile. While the large size of this weapon has extra reach, it also leads to less precise and more cumbersome attacks. And for those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 2 out of 5 for defense. My favorite thing about this build was its immersive quality when using the full set. However, the weapon alone couldn't quite meet the challenge of New Game +8. The aesthetic of the build was exceptional, and assembling all the items wasn't overly difficult. Yet playing this build felt somewhat tedious, and the weapon alone didn't make it feel like a fully realized build. For those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 0.5 out of 3 for fun, a 0.5 out of 3 for ease, a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to an 18.5 out of 40. If you feel like you can add something to this build to really complete it, let us know in the comments below.
At number 9, we have the Warsickle build. It's like a popsicle, but war. This build is themed around Loretta and centered around dual wielding or single-handeding a Warsickle. These are the recommended talismans for this build, but these would be excellent options as well. This is technically a quality build because it scales off of strength and dex equally. However, the magic damage and the Ash of War damage will come primarily from your intelligence scaling. The Loretta / Ash of War combination is distinct when used specifically on Loretta's Warsickle, as it scales off of all 3 stats, strength, dex, and int, unlike the Loretta / Ash of War combo on other weapons. This typically only scales off of intelligence. The Warsickle is also unique in that it attacks a little bit faster than other halberds. When dealing with bosses, this build had its moments, but also had some shortcomings. It's excellent against average bosses in general. Thanks to its successive attacks, quick strikes, and good range, it makes a really solid choice for most scenarios. However, when facing agile bosses, it could be hit or miss. Pun intended. Consistent hits led to quick victories. Unfortunately, against large bosses, it fell short despite being one of the faster hitting halberds, It lacked the necessary punch for their extensive health pools, and for those reasons, we're going to give it a 7 out of 10 for average bosses, a 2 out of 3 for agile bosses, and a 1 out of 3 for those big boys. In open world scenarios, this build performed quite well overall. It offered good coverage with its excellent range and relatively swift attacks. The Ash of War, while not a traditional AoE, managed to hit multiple enemies simultaneously, effectively functioning as an AoE, but with limited range. There weren't many scenarios where this build fell short, except for the slightly tricky nature of its successive attack moveset and the occasional inaccuracy of auto-targeting with jump attacks. And so for those reasons, we're going to give it a 4 out of 5 for open world. In PvP, this build faced some challenges. The successive attack strategy often didn't fare well against human opponents as they could easily dodge it. Unless you managed to stagger them with your Ash of War, it just wasn't very effective. Successive attack builds that excel in PvP typically work better with faster hitting weapons. The main advantage here was the extended reach. In PvP, we primarily relied on the Ash of War rather than the successive attacks, and so for those reasons, we're going to give it a 2 out of 5 for PvP. In terms of defense, this build had its shortcomings. It lacked guarding capabilities, you were quite vulnerable and could be taken down in one hit, especially in New Game Plus 8. The Ash of War did provide a reasonably reliable dodge, but aside from that, defensive options were limited, and for those reasons, we're going to give it a 1.5 out of 5 for defense. The aesthetic of this build was very immersive because you are a fully fleshed out character from the game. The Ash of War provided immense satisfaction when used, but the melee abilities could feel somewhat tedious. In order to dual wield the Warsickles, it required completing the game twice, and you had to fight Loretta, who is not the easiest boss to say the least. Despite the complete aesthetic, it just didn't stand out as the most astonishing. In truth, the most enjoyable aspect of this build was the Ash of War, and so for those reasons, we're going to give it a 1 out of 3 for fun, a 1 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, which brings the Warsickle build to a 21.5 out of 40. At number 8, we have the Onyx Build. These are the recommended talismans for this build, but these would be excellent options as well. This build stands out with a 20% damage boost against gravity-type creatures, like several others on this list, but we haven't gotten to those yet, so stay tuned. It features a distinctive Ash of War called Onyx Lord Repulsion, which involves planting your sword in the ground and triggering an explosion that not only knocks enemies back, but it also deals 100% magic damage. The initial part of the Ash of War also deals damage, but only if the enemy is directly next to you. Against average bosses, overall, this is a very solid choice to pick. The explosion of the Ash of War inflicts significant poise break, and it covers a good range. On top of that, your quick successive attacks are both efficient and effective. It's a 2-for-1 deal. Against agile bosses, there's not too much to say here. The build isn't really ideal for those situations. The Ash of War, you stick it in the ground and it's kind of slow moving. Large bosses, it was also kind of meh. It was easier to use the Ash of War on large bosses than it was agile bosses, but you still have a slow wind up, so you're only landing 1 or 2 at best, and you're really relying heavily on the successive attacks. For those reasons, we're going to give this build an 8 out of 10 for average bosses, a 1 out of 3 for agile bosses, and a 1 out of 3 for large bosses. In open world scenarios, there are virtually no complaints with this build. The Ash of War serves as a very potent AoE attack, capable of going through walls, which is really nice. And on top of that, it's just a really fun build to use in pretty much every open world scenario. The weapons have really good reach, really no complaints, so we're going to give it a 5 out of 5. In PvP, this build performed decently. Using the Ash of War was a little tricky, but you could deploy it behind walls and catch your opponents off guard, which was just great. The charge attacks with their sweeping strikes were quite effective, but overall this build just kind of lacked the versatility required for being a powerful PvP contender. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 2 out of 5 for PvP. This build had minimal defense, relying mostly on the Ash of War explosion to keep enemies at bay. It did seem to have a wider range than the Blaidd build, but you couldn't block. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 1.5 out of 5 for defense. This build was really enjoyable, and it featured a unique Ash of War that was tied to the sword. Obtaining this weapon from the boss was relatively straightforward, which made it a really easy choice. On top of that, curved swords are just really fun to use in general in Elden Ring, So overall, a very fun build to use. It just wasn't that immersive. For those reasons, we're gonna give it a 2 out of 3 for fun, a 1.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 1 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Onyx build to a 23 out of 40.
At number 7, we have the Radahn build. This build is centered around the Scar Scourge Greatsword, the Scar Scourge Greatsword, and the Lion's Greatbow. These are the recommended talismans for this build, but these would be excellent options as well. This build stands out because it combines both melee and ranged weapons. The Scar Scourge Greatsword is unique in that it's the only two-handed sword that can be dual-wielded without requiring a second copy. These weapons inflict 30% increased damage against gravity-type enemies, which include Estelle, the Fallingstar Beast, and the Alabaster Lords. Furthermore, the Ash of War benefits from the Highland Axe being held in your offhand and equipping the Roar Medallion, since it's considered a roar. The Greatbow is unique in that it synergizes with Radahn's arrows, allowing for 20% increased damage. The Lion Greatbow is what gives it that bonus, so you only need it in your offhand, which means you can use a stronger Greatbow to fire the arrows themselves. An example of that would be the Golem Greatbow. However, that's not what we're going to be doing in this video. While the Ash of War packs a punch, it doesn't truly excel in boss fights. Moreover, the slow and cumbersome successive attacks pose a significant challenge in New Game Plus 8. The bow, with its sluggish draw time, can serve as a potent opener or in niche situations, but generally doesn't find much utility in boss fights. So this build really struggled with large bosses, but way more against agile bosses, as you can imagine. Overall, this wasn't your boss fight build. For those reasons, we're giving it a 4 out of 10 for average boss, a 0 out of 3 for agile, and a 1.5 out of 3 for large. Nevertheless, in open world scenarios, this build truly excelled. Whether you're sniping your enemies off their feet with this oversized bow or pulling a group of enemies together to detonate them with devastating damage, this build excels in almost every open world situation. For those reasons, we're giving this build a 5 out of 5 for open world. These weapons prove challenging to land hits with in PvP due to their slow nature. However, the initial part of the Ash of War often connects even if the second part is dodged, making it effective against ranged enemies. If the explosion connects, it typically is a one-shot kill. Unfortunately, the predictability of the second part doesn't offer a significant advantage compared to other builds. The Lion Greatbow had its moments in sniping, but proved cumbersome during melee combat. For those reasons, we're giving the Radahn build a 3.5 out of 5 for PvP. Need I say more? This build lacks strong defensive capabilities due to its slow pacing. However, the gravitas component of the Ash of War, which draws enemies in and interrupts their abilities, contributes to overall damage mitigation. Additionally, this is one of the only weapons that can block while dual wielding. For those reasons, we're going to be giving the Radahn build a 2.5 out of 5 for defense. The Ash of War adds a cool factor, and the matching set enhances immersion. Obtaining these items in a single playthrough, especially early on, is also a plus. The uniqueness and fun factor of this entire set is undeniable. However, the slow-paced combat detracts from the satisfaction of facing bosses. For these reasons, we're going to be giving the Radahn build a 2 out of 3 for fun, a 2 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing this build to a 23.5 out of 40.
At number 6, we have the Darkmoon build. This build is centered around the Darkmoon Greatsword. These are the recommended talismans for this build, but these would be excellent options as well. This weapon's uniqueness lies in its primary scaling with intelligence, allowing it to deal more magic damage than physical damage. The Ash of War acts as a buff, enhancing your power attack to unleash a frosty slash. This power attack can be further boosted by the Godfrey icon, treating it as a spell, but it can also benefit from the Axe Talisman, provided enemies are within close range. The great thing about this Ash of War is that once the weapon is coated, the power attacks no longer consume any FP. Because of that, this provides the build with a little bit of extra range and added utility. The Darkmoon Greatsword performs admirably against bosses, particularly excelling against average ones due to its ability to build frost quickly. Against agile bosses, it can be challenging as the frost slash is relatively easy to dodge and it lacks range. Large bosses pose a similar challenge, but if you can accumulate frost buildup, it can lead to relatively swift victories. For those reasons, we're going to give it an 8.5 out of 10 for average bosses, a 1.5 out of 3 for agile bosses, and a 2 out of 3 for large bosses. In the open world, this build doesn't stand out particularly well in New Game Plus 8. As many of its abilities become underwhelming at that point, the ranged ability lacked the reach to be a useful sniping tool, and there was no significant AoE capability. Nevertheless, the extended duration of this weapon buff, coupled with the fact that it doesn't consume FP, proved to be valuable in effectively tackling those lengthy and challenging gauntlets. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 5 for open world. In PvP, this weapon fell somewhat short compared to the other builds on this list, for similar reasons mentioned in the open world scenarios. The Ash of War's efficiency was a plus during extended PvP battles, however, its slow attack speed and limited reach made it less valuable in combat, contributing to its underwhelming performance in PvP. And so for those reasons, we give it a 3.5 out of 5 for PvP. In terms of defense, this weapon does hold up reasonably well because of its range and its FP efficiency with the Ash of War. Guard boosting on this weapon is relatively low, so we leaned more towards dodging rather than relying on guard counters. And so for those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 5 for defense. Obtaining this weapon involves a lengthy quest line requiring the defeat of several challenging bosses, like Radahn and Estelle. Aesthetically, the weapon looks cool, but the Ash of War was somewhat lackluster, and there wasn't a complete immersive set to go with it. The build, while straightforward to use, was pretty underwhelming, especially as the game progressed. It seemed more potent in earlier parts of the game, but around New Game Plus 5, it really starts to lose its edge. And by New Game Plus 8, it felt totally incomplete and just didn't provide the damage that we'd hoped for. For those reasons, we're going to give this a 0.5 out of 3 for fun, a 0.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 1.5 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Darkmoon Greatsword to a 24 out of 40. How would you improve this build to enhance its effectiveness and ability? Let us know in the comments down below, because we think this build needs something.
At number 5, we have the Fallingstar build. This build is centered around the Fallingstar Beastjaw. These are the recommended talismans for this build. Notably, this weapon boasts the longest reach among all colossal weapons and inflicts both strike and pierce damage. Additionally, the Ash of War predominantly deals physical damage rather than magic damage, making it rely more on strength and dex scaling rather than intelligence. It also does 20% increased damage to all gravity type enemies. Despite numerous nerfs, the Ash of War still performed admirably against most standard bosses. While the weapon's attacks were notably slow, relying on the Ash of War's range spamming made it versatile in various scenarios, even against some agile bosses. However, that did not translate very well over to larger bosses. For those reasons, we're going to be giving the Fallingstar build an 8.5 out of 10 for average bosses, a 2 out of 3 for agile, and a 1.5 out of 3 for large. In open world encounters, this build excelled thanks to the spammable Ash of War and the overall competency of the weapon. However, it struggled when facing large groups due to the absence of an effective AoE ability. And for those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 4 out of 5 for open world. In PvP, this build exerted pressure with its powerful, long-reaching attacks, often followed by the Ash of War to disrupt foes attempting to escape or heal. Spamming the Ash of War made it exceptionally challenging for opponents to handle, and for those reasons, we're giving this build a 4 out of 5 for PvP. The primary defensive advantage of this build is maintaining distance, accompanied by decent guard counters and the ability to break an opponent's poise effectively with melee attacks. For those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 3 out of 5 for defense. This build proved enjoyable, particularly in PvP, thanks to its field control capabilities. It held its own against most bosses and remained versatile in numerous scenarios. While the weapon boasts an epic appearance, the weapon art falls a bit short compared to the grand aesthetics in this lineup. Although there's no matching set, acquiring the weapon itself isn't too demanding, and the gameplay is pretty straightforward. For those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 1.5 out of 3 for fun, a 2.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 1 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the grand total to a 28 out of 40.
At number 4, we have the Executioner build. This build is centered around dual wielding the Rosus'ss axes. These are the recommended talismans for this build. This weapon primarily deals physical damage in a successive attacks build. The Ash of War seamlessly combines a power attack with the Tibia Summon spell. The Tibia Summons activates instantly upon your attack, allowing your skeleton companions to continue the assault even if you die, or just get hit out of the animation. What's advantageous about the Tibia Summons is that it attacks from multiple angles, which can bypass shields and assists in triggering your successive attacks. This build excels at rapidly accumulating successive attacks, thanks to both the Ash of War and your very quick moveset. The constant melee pressure allows you to swiftly dismantle bosses within seconds, even 1 second. Not that fast. The high speed attacks prove valuable when facing agile bosses, and large bosses are particularly vulnerable, ensuring that your Tibia summon spells almost always hit their mark. For those reasons, we gave the Executioner build a 9 out of 10 for average bosses, a 2.5 out of 3 for agile bosses, and a 3 out of 3 for large bosses. Exploring the open world with this build was a blast, thanks to your swift mobility, which set it apart from the other builds on this list. The Ash of War efficiently dispatched enemies regardless of their size, without draining your resources excessively. Pairing this build with the Sacrificial Axe for extended gauntlets in the open world was a very smart move on my part, as each kill replenished your FP. While the Tibia summons could act as an AoE if clustered, it's worth noting that the build doesn't feature a dedicated AoE ability, and so for those reasons, we gave it a 3.5 out of 5 for the open world. When it came to PvP, the fast attack speed unfortunately just didn't perform as well as anticipated. Its close range nature left it outperformed by weapons with longer reach, or even faster close range options. Landing the Tibia summon spell proved to be a challenge, but when successful, it was essentially a one-hit KO. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 2 out of 5 for PvP. When it came to defense, it's very clear that this build doesn't fare well as you dual wield without any defensive capabilities. Some would say this is a glass cannon, I would call it an axe cannon. The Ash of War being a close range ability can stagger opponents, but you often end up taking hits before that happens, so for those reasons, we gave it a 1.5 out of 5 for defense. This build turned out to be surprisingly enjoyable, considering we always just overlook this weapon. The relentless pressure from the successive attacks remained effective even in New Game Plus 8. It offered a lot of fun, and it was easily obtainable. However, it's just important to note that close range successive attack builds that lack defense and ranged abilities can just generally be quite challenging. While the weapons and abilities were cool, in comparison to the other options and weapon arts on this list, it just didn't quite reach top tier, and so for those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 2 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Executioner build to a 28.5 out of 40.
At number 3, we have the Destruction build. This build is centered around the Ruins Greatsword. These are the recommended talismans for this build, but these would be excellent options as well. Despite its requirement for intelligence, this weapon primarily scales off strength for both melee attacks and Ash of War usage. This weapon also has a unique charge attack, which does slam the ground, causing additional damage, and will hit other enemies within a close proximity. This doesn't cost any FP, but will consume a massive amount of stamina in the process. Given its nature as a colossal slab, this weapon offers robust guarding capabilities and effective physical damage reduction when blocking. This quality makes it highly valuable for a guard counter build, consistently breaking an opponent's poise. This weapon stood out for its potent, close quarters and ranged capabilities. You could enhance charge attacks with various talismans and physic tiers, resulting in devastating melee strikes. This made it highly effective against average and large bosses. However, agile bosses posed a significant challenge as they often evaded the Ash of War entirely, rendering it ineffective and leaving you with these sluggish melee attacks as your main option. For those reasons, we're going to be giving the Ruins Greatsword a 8 out of 10 for average bosses, a 0.5 out of 3 for agile, and a 2 out of 3 for large bosses. In open world scenarios, this build excelled. The Ash of War could clear entire hallways within seconds, and the powerful charge attacks obliterated virtually any enemy. Moreover, the guard countering ability proved invaluable in the open world, and for those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 5 out of 5 for open world. Nevertheless, the abilities that excelled in open world were also the most straightforward for players to dodge, rendering them less effective in PvP. And for those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 2 out of 5 for PvP. As previously mentioned, this build is incredibly sturdy. This weapon boasts an impressive physical damage guard rating of 82, surpassing the capabilities of many shields. The only minor downside is the relatively slow overall movement, and for those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 4 out of 5 for defense. Using this build was immensely satisfying. If you crave that epic feel for your heavy charge attacks, look no further. The weapon art and moveset are not only visually appealing, but also unique and potent. Plus, it's relatively straightforward to obtain and wield. As a fan of the Blasphemous Blade, the Ash of War does not disappoint, even without the healing feature. It's quite rare to find a tanky build that doesn't rely on a shield, and for those reasons, we're giving this build a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 3 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to a 29.5 out of 40. And at number 2, we have the HelphenWellness build. This build is centered around 2 Helphen steeple and scales off of wellness. It does well. These are the recommended talismans for this build, but these would be excellent options as well. This build is unique because it's basically just a successive attack build, but the Ash of War gives it a very potent ability. This build stands out due to its focus on successive attacks and jump attacks, with the Ash of War adding significant power to each strike. The Ash of War, named Ruinous Ghost Flame, coats your weapon with Ghost Flame for 60 seconds. Interestingly, despite the name, it does not deal fire damage. Instead, it adds raw magic damage and increases frostbite buildup. This makes both your intelligence and strength scaling crucial. Once frostbite is applied, your melee attacks will gain an additional 20% damage boost against the enemy. Thanks to the ability to deliver rapid and devastating damage, this build excelled against average bosses, often melting them in no time. The potent frost damage also proved effective against larger bosses since they tend to have a larger health pool. However, things became a bit challenging when facing agile bosses due to the close range combat style. For those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 10 out of 10 for average bosses, a 1.5 out of 3 for agile, and a 3 out of 3 for large. This build primarily revolves around buff routines followed by devastating damage, making it effective against bosses. However, the need to frequently reapply buffs could become a bit tedious in open world scenarios. When traversing the open world, we pretty much just relied on the Ash of War. Your immense damage output swiftly dispatched most foes. Nevertheless, the build lacked defensive capabilities and any form of AoE ability, and for those reasons, we're going to be giving this build a 3 out of 5 for open world. To our surprise, these weapons excelled in PvP, thanks to their consistently devastating attacks that kept relentlessly pressuring opponents. The need to pause and buff only every 60 seconds was also a plus. Moreover, the weapon's epic jousting ability, activated by dodging without any direction and then triggering it with the LB button, resembled the crouch poke but with even more impact. I would highly recommend giving this PvP build a try, as it might be something many people overlook. For those reasons, we're giving this build a 5 out of 5 for PvP. Unfortunately, this build lacks defensive capabilities and relies on close quarters combat without any ranged or high poise breaking abilities, making it essentially a glass cannon. For those reasons, we're giving it a 1 out of 5 for defense. Part of the fun with this build was the element of surprise. I always obtained this weapon, but never really gave it much consideration. However, when I finally tried it out, it turned out to be quite a hidden gem. Acquiring this weapon isn't too difficult, as it's just a Tibia Mariner, but you do need to venture into these snowy areas and get a second one to unlock its true potential, which can be a bit challenging. While the first build is undeniably potent, it requires a fearless approach to close quarters combat. Nevertheless, these swords look incredibly badass, especially when they're set ablaze. For those reasons, we're going to be giving the HelphenWellness build a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 2 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing this build to a 31.5 out of 40.
And at number 1, we have Death's Penis. At number 1 on this list, we have Death's Poker. These are the recommended talismans for this build. Although it's another frost build on this list, it sets itself apart by having the ability to accumulate frostbite faster than any of the other builds on this list. Its primary focus is on the Ash of War, known as Ghost Flame Ignition. The initial part of the Ash of War pokes the target with a spot of Ghost Flame, which accumulates and explodes after a few seconds, dealing magic damage and increasing frost buildup. However, if you follow up the Ash of War with a standard attack or a power attack, you can add a little remix to the ignition that is fresh out of the kitchen. The standard attack variant releases a forward projecting AoE of Ghost Flame, causing damage over time. On the other hand, the power attack variant delivers a ground slam with an additional explosion, making it highly effective for single or multiple targets if they're in range. The potent Ash of War variants make this build ideal for dealing with average bosses. When it comes to large bosses, they can be swiftly taken down thanks to the area of effect aspect of the Ash of War, as all the flames connect and inflict damage over time. We put this to the test against numerous large bosses and it worked exceptionally well. However, this build faced its greatest challenge with agile bosses, as landing the Ash of War could be very tricky. Nonetheless, given that most of the abilities had an AoE component, it wasn't too difficult to connect with the target. And for those reasons, we're going to give Death's Poker a 10 out of 10 for average bosses, a 1.5 out of 3 for agile bosses, and a 2.5 out of 3 for large bosses. In the open world, this build excelled and easily annihilated everything in its path. The AoE of Ghost Flame Ignition could obliterate entire waves of enemies. Even on New Game Plus 8, foes fell like flies. I mean, come on. For those reasons, we're going to give it a 5 out of 5 for open world. In PvP, this build performed excellently, although it had one significant downside. The Ash of War could leave you vulnerable. However, because you could dodge roll out of both the first and second parts of the Ash of War, you did have some versatility and weren't completely locked into the animation for too long. When casting the Ash of War, your opponent wouldn't know which variant of the spell you were going to use, as there are many options available, adding an element of surprise to your attacks. So for those reasons, we're going to give it a 4 out of 5 for PvP. The defense of this build fell short, as it lacked a robust defensive strategy. The only advantage in terms of defense was having some nice range abilities and the ability to dodge out of your Ash of War if necessary. However, the real upside to this build was its incredible offensive power, as it dispatched enemies so quickly that relying on defense often became unnecessary. Despite the unassuming appearance of the Death's Poker, this weapon proves to be an incredibly fun and satisfying weapon to wield. While melee combat was an option, we predominantly relied on the Ash of War, so having a second weapon didn't really make that much of a difference. This means you can obtain your full set right from the start. You can acquire it by defeating a Deathrite Bird in Caelid, and really quickly at that matter if you know how to cheese it. Given how effective and enjoyable this build is, it truly lives up to the hype. As a quick note, if you're high level enough to spec accordingly, you can dual wield this weapon with the Blasphemous Blade for a really potent fire and ice melee build. And for those reasons, we're going to give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 2.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, which brings the Death's Poker build to a 32.5 out of 40 and number 1 on this list.
That wraps up our list of the top 10 strength intelligence builds for Elden Ring. We followed these general stats for almost every build on our list. If you believe that there's a build that deserved a spot but didn't make it, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We're also eager to hear if you agree or disagree with any of our tier list rankings. If you think some builds should have scored higher or lower, don't hesitate to share your opinion. As always, thanks for watching.